Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this breakaway session, and hopefully you're able to hear us very well. Could you confirm if you're able to hear us very well? Could we have a member confirm if they are able to hear us? Jabba, Wilson, Anthony. Jill, you're unmuted. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, I am. Thank you. I was trying to, it wasn't taking my voice. We're hearing you very well.
Yes, and thanks for joining our session. We'll be starting shortly. We are waiting for other participants to join us. So welcome to this session on incentivizing research and innovation. So you're very much welcome, and we will be presenting to you very soon. Okay, so welcome once again to this session on research and innovation among African higher education institutions in conflict setting, where we shall be presenting the understanding of Somalia and South Sudan higher education institutions research and innovation ecosystem. Myself, Nathan Tumuhami, and Angela Tukunda will be presenting this session. We all work with the Resilient Africa Network, of which we shall also briefly tell you about in our next slide. So welcome to this session, and thank you so much for joining. Audrey, we can go to the next slide. So this presentation will basically look at introduction and background. I will provide some context on South Sudan and Somalia in regard to research ecosystem, and then briefly highlight some of the methods that we used to undertake this study that we shall be presenting, then give you some context of the findings and the results and the implications of these findings, as well as the recommendations, and then we shall end with some takeaway message. Next slide. So this is part of the broader laser pulse research. And LASER is long-term assistance and services for research, which is a 5-year program that is funded by USAID through the Innovation Technology and Research Hub to mainly deliver research solutions to development challenges. LASER is basically a consortium that is led by Purdue University with core partners including Catholic Relief Services, Indiana University, Makerere University, and under Makerere University, that's where we fall in the Resilient Africa Network, and the University of Notre Dame as implementers of the LASER projects. And it's a very growing network of over 2,700 researchers from 62 countries globally. So LASER is basically a closer collaboration between the researchers, the development partners, the policymakers and donors that are supporting research and research translation, looking at activities that include research funding through requests for proposals, capacity strengthening of the researchers that are part of the network that I earlier talked about, the over 2,700 researchers, but also trying to identify research needs, one of which is the capacity gaps of the results that we shall be presenting as one of the broader activities under LASER on how we can identify research needs within higher education institutions and then be able to tailor our capacity strengthening initiatives that speak to those needs. And then, of course, one of the core functions of LASER is embedded research translation, as well as integration of gender and trying to support a bigger network of these researchers with these services. Next slide. Go to the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Yes, so this research was conducted by the Resilient Africa Network, which is based at Makerere University, and it's a network which is initially that was formed under the Higher Education Solutions Network at USAID in 2012, and currently it's one of the largest networks across the Africa continent, bringing scholars to advance research and innovations. We are currently linked to 32 universities in 16 countries in Africa, organized around the 4 regional hubs, which we call the Resilience Innovation Labs. We have one based here at Makerere University in Uganda, coordinating universities in East Africa. We have another lab based at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, coordinating universities in Southern Africa region. And then our third lab is based in Ghana at University for Development Studies, coordinating universities in West Africa. And then our fourth lab is in the Horn of Africa in Ethiopia, based at Jimma University. So this is a network that has been working on research and innovations across these countries for the last almost 10 years now, and we've been mainly supported by USAID. And I will now shift to the research. Next slide. So in terms of this research that we are presenting today, it was conducted in Somalia and South Sudan, of which both countries are conflict-affected countries. And of course, we also know that higher education institutions, especially in the developing economies, are very much strategically positioned to generate evidence, of which evidence could be used by policymakers and development practitioners to make decisions on social transformation and economic transformation within these countries. However, we also know that in the post-conflict setting and societies, sometimes security affects a number of research activities, and sometimes also even when you're conducting data collection activities, this trigger even to the actual research respondents. And this is one of the biggest challenges most of the higher education institutions in these conflict settings are facing. but we also have, of course, the psychological scars that come through the issues of the war, which is rampant in most of these conflict settings. And even when most of these institutions are able to undertake research, of course, there are quite a number of challenges. And as such, we also, of course, faced a number of challenges as we conducted this research, and we shall be able to provide some of the context under which some of these are able to operate and conduct research in such kind of settings. Next. In terms of quickly taking you through South Sudan, South Sudan is the world's newest nation, which we are talking about a country that started in July 2011, and it has a total of only 6 universities, 5 of which are government-owned, and only 1 university is private. In South Sudan, most of these top administrators in these universities owned by government are appointed by the president. So if for someone to be a vice chancellor or a deputy vice chancellor, it has to be an appointment that comes from the president. And most of these universities do not even have specific departments responsible for research. So that's one of the biggest challenges they have. So research, yes, is done, but it's mainly academic research and not even development research. And most importantly, one of the biggest challenges is mainly the vicious cycle of insecurity and poverty, which is even affecting the budgets that countries, that South Sudan government trickle to the higher education institutions. But also we know that even within this context, the female participation in research is one of the biggest challenges, and we shall be able to present to you some of the findings that we found around this strategic component of female engagement in research. Next, as we talk about Somalia, so Somalia is, of course, also a conflict setting found in the Horn of Africa. Whereas in Somalia, there are quite a number of higher education institutions compared to South Sudan. Most of these institutions are currently undergoing a lot of, transformation and how they operate, given that there was a collapse of most of these institutions following the civil war in Somalia. We also see that most of the social services, including roads, education, health, energy, and transportation, within most of the cities and towns in Somalia were mostly disrupted during the conflict, and this did not spare the operations of the higher education institutions within this country. And of course, through research and innovation, the higher education institutions have a bigger role to play in rebuilding this country. So that's why we were able to go out and try to undertake a study to understand a number of issues regarding higher education institutions in this country. Next. So our basic study that we conducted in these 2 countries was looking at 3 main areas within the higher education institutions. One was for us to understand the existing systems and infrastructure, support research and research translation in these countries, but also the extent to which research is translated and put in practice within these countries. Our third area of focus for the research was understand the sustainability mechanisms for research initiatives, especially within such conflict settings. And with this, we were able to also interface with a number of researchers through key informant interviews to understand their experiences, the challenges and opportunities to engage in research and research translation. And findings from this have been used to design capacity building interventions and research courses which some of them are currently running within laser projects. So we have a number of capacity building initiatives that speak to the findings from these studies. Next. So quickly, in terms of summary of the methods, we basically went out to do this assessment within higher education institutions, and we looked at, we employed both qualitative and quantitative methods to collect data from these higher education institutions. We did a survey in 13 universities. Of course, Somalia contributed more universities, 10 universities, and out of the 5 universities in South Sudan, we were able to reach to 3 of these universities that participated in our survey. We had a total of 28 key informant interviews, especially from most of the top university administrators, trying to provide information on infrastructure, sustainability mechanisms, as well as research translation avenues. And then we also did a survey from the 7 universities. So the survey was at a university level, trying to understand the infrastructure at a university level, trying to understand issues around policies, the human resource, and other aspects that we shall be presenting in our results. So when we talk of the 7 surveys, this means we were able to do a survey from the 7 higher education institutions from these 2 countries, in addition to the key informant interviews. So I will invite my colleague Angela to take us through the next slide on the next slides on the results that we did both qualitatively and quantitatively. Angela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. I hope I am audible enough. And my name is Angela Tkunda. I work at the Resilient African Network. I'll briefly put on my video briefly because I would need to switch it off to improve my bandwidth. So before I go on to the next slides, thank you, Jill. I can see that you posted a question in the chat room that what were the biggest challenges we faced while trying to bring formally warring clans and tribes together. I can answer this along with Nathan, but Nathan can go first, because Nathan, can you maybe respond to Jill's question, and then we'll move on to the results.
Yes, thank you so much, Angela, and thanks, Jill, for this important question. The challenges trying to bring the warring tribes, definitely for us, our focus was research within the higher education institutions. So we were not in any way involved in mediations regarding the tribes and the clans within the different countries. But of course, this somehow affected our research, because in some institutions, like in South Sudan, we were unable to reach out to these institutions because either they were closed because of the conflict, or sometimes the researchers would not be
I think the internet on your side, Nathan, is misbehaving, but thank you very much. Yes, Jill, we thank you very much for this
information. So we know that this, but our is
Nathan, I think your internet is on and off, but thank you very much. Yes, you had answered Jill's question. Well, to re-echo what he just said, we had this assessment in higher education institutions, specifically universities, in South Sudan and Somalia. So we did not visit the communities. We mainly looked at challenges that these universities in conflict setting areas or in conflict zones were facing. And some of the challenges that came out were because of these tribal issues, the warring tribes, but these were brought up by the universities, not the communities themselves. Thank you. And I don't know if you would need further clarity, but I am happy and Nathan is happy to answer any other question that you may have. We encourage more questions in the chat room. We encourage comments. We encourage so that we are interacting other than just talking to you. We are sorry where the network is on and off. We've been having issues of internet connection in the entire country, but we hope it will be well. So I am going to move on to the findings from the assessment. So overall, we discovered that conflict was affecting research in the two countries, both directly and indirectly. And these were reported by participants where, for example, excuse me, in this slide, the participants reported brain drain, inability to access some communities and study sites, monetization of research, low funding, and hesitance of some funders due to problems with security. And then researchers were also unable to publish findings that were highlighting shortcomings of the ruling government. So in a way, the researchers were not independent and were not able to publish findings where they found that they would contradict what the ruling government was doing. For example, you can see from that quote where one of the participants said he feared for his life to publish some findings. So he was advised by his friend to go and change the results and write a different kind of paper. So this just shows that the researchers were not independent of the ruling governments if their findings were contrary to what the governments were doing. Audrey, next slide. Yes, so still about brain drain. So the participants reported that most of the researchers were leaving the country in pursuit of greener pastures. I mean, better working conditions where they were safe. So this left most of the senior researchers out of the countries because some have moved to the UK, some are actually in other African countries, but not in Somalia and not in South Sudan. Then even the ones who stayed in their own countries reported that their jobs were not secure because they feared anytime there's another insurgent or the government changes, they may be changed and they will be left jobless. And then inaccessibility to some communities as study sites. Because of the long standing conflicts in these areas, some tribes are hostile and they do not trust any strangers or any outsiders in their communities. So they would not tolerate anyone to visit their communities, either to collect data or conduct any interviews. And this also impacted research. Then there was an issue of monetization of research where participants thought they should be paid for any participation in research. This may come as a result of the fact that they are used to humanitarian aid. Any outsiders that visit their areas usually gives them, something, gives them some money. And as a result, the researchers reported that even when they are carrying out research, the participants usually want to be paid for it. And then hesitance of some funders. Some funders found it hard to put their money in areas affected by conflict, especially if funding was, if the research projects were driven at making money, if it was maybe a project where the funder wanted to scale out something, they found it hard to put their funding in these areas affected by conflict. And then the government was not committing any funds to research. And this is because the government said they don't have money for research because of wars. You can see some of these quotes from the participants in that table. And like the first one, government already says they don't have money to support research because of war. That was from one of the participants from South Sudan. And then another one says there are still conflicts, malicious people are in communities, and when they meet you in their communities, they kill you. So these have impacted research and still impact research even presently. Next slide. I see we have some questions in the chat room. And I beg that let's address some of them as we move along. So Sandland, thank you very much. You're asking, is being affiliated with any particular university, anyone versus another in Africa, inherently risk in these conflict zones? So what we found out with affiliation was that some of these universities which are affiliated to donor agencies, ones giving aid, like the US aid, UK aid, were more favored than strictly private money-making institutions, because these are kind of owned by the communities because they are always giving them aid, as compared to the ones which are completely private. And then the government-owned facilities were particularly, I don't want to call it favored, but they had closer partnerships with their governments, their ministries and departments, as compared to the private universities. So the affiliation can come in there, and Nathan can as well. Oh, well, I've seen his chart. Being affiliated to a particular university is not a risk because universities are largely viewed as neutral. Yes, except for private versus government, where the partnership is where the partnership came in. Okay, and then hoping for that answer, but good to know for sure. I don't know if that is satisfactory, but you can as well ask for more clarity if you need to. And then, and communities highly trust HEIs because universities admit students irrespective of tribe. Yes, these communities, as we shall see later in the slides, the communities have a big arm in the universities, and universities have a very big arm in the communities. So the community engagements from these HEIs were a strength to the HEIs in research, because the communities kind of owned the research institutions, and this was a strength, as we shall see in the slides. Thank you. So research infrastructure. So institutional support services and infrastructure. There are some areas which were of strength and areas which were really weaknesses, as we can see in our graph. For example, all the universities sampled, none of them had an internationally accredited research laboratory. And the median score was 0, but still all of them scored 0. None of these institutions had an international accredited research laboratory. And then we can see that they had a mean score of 1. In one, I can give 1 represented 0 to 20% availability in the scales. 2 was 21 to 40. This will come even in the other slides. I want us to know what they represent. Then 3 was 41 to 60. And then 4, 61 to 80. 5 was excellent, completely available. And this was 81 to 100. So as you can see, most of these sub-themes, sub-scores are less than 3 and downwards, meaning that the infrastructure in these universities wasn't really the best, and there's no area where the institutions scored complete availability. We don't have any score of 4 on availability of institutional support services and infrastructure. And then we can see from the quotes One of the participants in South Sudan reported that they do not have internet connectivity at all in the university. It was only the Deputy Chancellor's office that had internet. And this was even a challenge as we collected this data. Because of conflict, we were not able to visit some areas. So we conducted it online, but using telephone calls, not Zoom, they cannot do anything where it requires internet. So that was one strong weakness. Infrastructure was lacking. Next slide, Audrey. The other one was human resource management for research. So the human resource management for research also had areas of strength and weaknesses. For example, the university scored best at having, that doesn't appear very clear, but the 5 was undergraduate programs having a research project and field placements. All the universities in these HEI, in these 2 conflict setting countries, were having research projects and field placements for their undergraduates. But at the same time, these universities do not have existing doctoral training programs. None of them had that, and only 2 universities had existing PhD training programs out of 13. And then we can also see that these other human resource development sub-themes were all scoring 2 and 3, meaning low availability and very low, which were all weaknesses in these areas. Next slide, Andre. Okay, about empowerment for research, here we assessed involvement of the usually marginalized groups, females and young researchers. How are they involved in research? And we found very low involvement of female researchers in research activities, where the median score was 1, which was very low involvement of research for all the universities that we surveyed. While the junior staff were adequately supported to gain research experience and participated in research with a score of 4, the last one on the slide. And then the incentives for females to participate in research were mainly affirmative action during recruitment, promotion, and provision of equal opportunities. They were not selective on wanting to take only male researchers, but still the female research involvement was very low in research. Then junior staff were mainly adequately supported through training, mentorship. Some universities were giving them promotions, and then holidays at good destinations, at good hotels where they have always dreamt of, going for holidays. Next slide, Audrey. Yes, about empowerment. While incentives for female researchers were available, there was a wide gender disparity among the staffs in these universities who had PhDs. Only 4 out of 113 faculty with PhDs were female. That is only 4%. So you can see that this is really, really a big difference. The blue are males, and then the female, you can see from the pie charts that it's mainly gender. I don't want to go gender insensitive, but mainly male were involved in research, and mainly males had PhDs. While male enrollment for both undergraduate and graduate programs was also significantly higher than that of females. Okay, next slide. About research and innovation infrastructure, specifically looking at policies, institutions having clear intellectual property rights and all. The universities also scored very low and law. None of the institutions had existing institutional protection of intellectual property and commercialization of research. None of them had scored 5. All of them would score 1, 2, 3, and that is a big capacity gap. That's a big gap in these higher education institutions in conflict settings. And then research outputs and dissemination was even not a prominent feature of technical faculties. So this was also a big gap about the research strategies and policies in these institutions. Next slide, please. Okay, about the institutional services and infrastructure still. So in this, we assessed presence and availability of research support offices, availability of a research agenda, policies and guidelines. And like you can see on our screens, the research support offices were available, 80% available. And then we had research policies and guidelines, about 80%. I mean, those are the median scores, but we did not have international accredited research laboratories, like we said before. And then these other accessibility and functionality of grants management units or offices and subscription to international peer-reviewed journals. So these, we have some strength, but mainly weaknesses about services and infrastructure in these conflict setting countries. Next slide, please. Okay, so from about management and control. So funding for research from these countries mainly came from donors, from well-wishers, donors, and very rarely from the government. So partners like NGOs, other institutions, private individuals funded the researchers in these institutions. And for private institutions, it was mainly from the tuition they collected from their students. Very rarely, the funding came from the government, and this was specifically for government-owned institutions. So the institutions having a fully functional the institution having a functional provision to fund research from within its own local funds, in addition to external funding, scored a median score of 1, which is really, really low. Meaning these universities are depending on development partners and donors. And then the extent to which the research support offices received adequate funding to undertake their activities. Remember, these research support offices were available up to 80%, but funding for them was not available. And then mainly government institutions got funding, unlike the private institutions, specifically from the government. We can see from the quotes, the quote is mainly talking about the difference in availability of funding from the government, for the government institutions as private institutions. Okay, next slide. About linkages and partnerships. South Sudan based higher education institutions reported that they had a close partnership with their governments because all approvals for research came from the government. So either way, they had to have a close partnership. If they did not have a close partnership, then their research would not be approved. Excuse me. And then in Somalia, there existed strong linkages for government-owned institutions, but rarely for private-owned institutions. In this graph, I don't know why. Well, these scores are talking about institutions having adequate access to higher education institution researchers from high-income country, universities for research partnerships, and this scored a median score of 1. So there was barely any adequate access of partnerships from higher education institutions in developed countries for these countries in South Sudan and Somalia. And then another weak point was extent to which institutions have sufficient opportunities for engagement of policymakers. That also scored a median of 2, which is also a weak score. The strength was in institutions having strong technical linkages with national level sector ministries, and this was even more marked in government-owned institutions. And then institutions having strong linkages and community level presence, where they scored 4. Yes, so these institutions have strong linkages with community level presence. They had a strong arm in their community. Next slide. Okay, so we also looked at challenges to research translation and usability of research findings. And respondents reported inadequate skills for research translation as hindering usability of their research findings. Then institutional research administration or management systems, where it was not easy to have your findings translated and used where the researchers thought they would use them, the stringent systems at the universities, then weak partnerships between the researchers, policymakers, and practitioners. And there was a cultural barrier where this was mainly because of the religious belief, where Arabs believed that their wives should be home-based. And if any study was done that was, for example, addressing the fact that women should be left to work or women should be empowered to participate in research, it would not be easy for these findings to be sold out to the community. So they had these cultural and religious barriers. And then insecurity, some areas were practically inaccessible to have study findings translated or even shared in these communities. And even the researchers feared to share some findings because of fear of the ruling governments. And then hostile communities, which comes along with the chronic insecurity that has been going on in that area. So we incorporated in some quotes which are talking about, because these are findings from the interviews where the higher education institution researchers were telling us why they do not use their research findings and why they are not applying them. And then they also thought that maybe if these were addressed and ways suggested on how to address the insecurity, the skill gap, it would be easy for them to put their research findings into products so that they are used for development. So every research we are doing and every finding that we have goes directed to our government. This has improved research translation for our development studies. And this was for a government-owned HEI in Somalia. The close collaboration between government and government-owned HEIs came out really, really strong in the 2 countries. And next slide. Okay, so what do these findings mean for low and middle income countries affected by conflict? The findings highlight the gaps in the research ecosystem in the low and middle income countries which are affected by conflict. And they also show that the females are not really participating in research and innovation. This is like a question. One wonders why, because 4% really of all women having PhDs and less involvement in research activities. It is something that needs to be explored. And then there are barriers to research translation affecting researchers in these conflict areas that also need to be addressed in order for this research to make a change in people's lives in these conflict setting areas. Next slide. So we had some recommendations that HEIs in conflict settings should prioritize the empowerment of groups that are marginalized within the institutional research setup, especially women, because it came out strong that ladies were not really participating in research. And then for sustainability, other than depending on donations and money from other private entities, there's need to include in the HEI's budgets or a budget line for supporting research using internal funds, and then improving the provision of institutional support services for research within their constituent academic units, such as internet. Things like internet should be basic. And then development agencies should increasingly engage with these HEIs in Africa, especially in conflict setting areas as partners in development. This would help them improve their research and innovation ecosystems. Then there's also need to improve political stability and security in these conflict fragile countries to create an environment that favors research. And next slide. And this is where we come with our take-home message, where it's obvious that insecurity affects research ecosystems in low and middle-income countries. And then there should be efforts to address insecurity in order to improve research in these areas. And then about the women in these areas affected by conflicts, they need to be empowered to participate in research, because it is known that conflict really affects the minority, the minor, the children, the women. It affects them much more than men. Could be one of the reasons why these women are not participating in research or even going to schools, like not attaining PhDs. And then the research gaps in low and middle income countries affect the conduct and usability of research and innovation findings. Yes, and that's all. Thank you very much. Next slide, Audrey. Okay, I know we have some questions in the chat room, which Nathan has been trying to answer. Nathan, you could unmute and answer some of the questions.
So thank you so much, Angela, for presenting the results. I've been trying to respond to a number of questions, but I must say that, of course, one critical aspect is on whether our findings could apply to other conflict settings. Yes, it is, because we had done another similar assessment within 12 countries, but this was combining both conflict and non-conflict, and the findings were a bit agreeing to what we see in the conflict setting. So it's true that most of these findings are applicable to other conflict settings, except that it will depend on how long the country has been in a conflict. For example, when you go to the currently countries like, areas like in Ethiopia, where the conflict has just started within one of the regions, you might not find that possibly the infrastructure is broken down compared to what is happening in South Sudan and Somalia, which have been in the conflict for quite a long time. So that is one aspect that we need to take note of. But also we found that there were mainly 5 areas which we found a lot of gaps across these 2 countries. One was on the research leadership, which was a big challenge within most of these universities, and of course project management. Mostly in South Sudan, we did not find any university implementing a development project. At least in Somalia, there were some universities that were working with development partners to support research and research transaction within the communities. But in South Sudan, most of the development partners were doing research on their own compared to working with higher education institutions, because the universities possibly say that most of these development partners did not perceive them to have the capacity, but also to have the infrastructure to support this kind of work. There were issues around empowerment. Angela has really basically elaborated much around empowerment. Issues of dissemination was a very, very big challenge, and research applicability, which broadly speaks to the lesser core function of translation and how researchers work with the development partners along the continuum of research, right from the research design to the applicability of the research findings. And we really found this as a very big gap within these countries. And then, of course, issues of empowerment, which Angela has talked about. And then sustainability was mainly around the funding from governments within these settings. There was literally no funding that was coming from government to support research. And that's why a number of these universities were mainly supporting research dissertations for students instead of research that speak to the development agenda of their specific countries, simply because they were not having funding to undertake this kind of rigorous research. So basically, that is what we can say in this area. Otherwise, it was quite interesting to understand what is happening in a conflict setting and then try to see what is happening in other countries. I must say that whereas these 5 areas of weakness within the conflict setting were as presented, we found relatively similar challenges within the non-conflict setting, especially when it comes to research leadership and also aspects of sustainability. So we found that even in non-conflict settings, countries, there are still a lot of gaps in research funding. It's only in Ethiopia because, again, in Ethiopia, there is a strong funding that is coming from government, which is channeled to the government institutions. And then in South Africa and particularly in Uganda, which funding just started 3 years ago, but initially government was not investing any funding in research. So we realized that largely the issues of sustainability and funding for higher education institutions across Africa is still a very huge challenge. And most of them do not even meet the 1% of the GDP being invested in research. We largely don't find any of the countries meeting that agenda, which was set by the African Union to invest at least 1% of GDP in research. So it's only South Africa which is getting closer to this, but the rest of the countries are still far. Even Ethiopia, which has taken a very big stride in terms of funding research within universities.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathan. We can have one more question. Anyone who would like to ask, you can actually unmute yourself and we hear from
I
you.
see another question in the chat. I think it was sent as a direct message instead of sending it to everyone. But thank you for from John Agaba. Thank you for the presentation. How can we encourage research and innovation in higher education institutions in this conflict setting? Yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think one is just like most of the research has suggested, we need to do a lot of partnerships between the global south and the global north to make sure that we enhance the capacities of HEIs within this conflict setting and build their capacity to undertake a number of research projects, but also work towards aligning a number of research projects to the national development agendas within the different countries. So we know most of these countries, look at South Sudan, for example, it's a young country, still trying, we work with these HEIs within these countries to support their capacity to work with their governments to ensure that maybe a number of these areas are enhanced. So one of these should be partnerships, then capacity strengthening, but as well as continuing to encourage these countries to involve even females into research so that they can also be PIs, but also be able to engage constructively in research projects.
Thank you, Nathan. And yes, I think partnerships is one of the biggest ways we can encourage these HEIs to participate in research, because on these institutions reported that they do not have partnerships with universities from developed countries, which which could help. If they had them, this could help them, do a lot of research. It can even help them strengthen their capacity, but this is not existent. So partnerships is one of the strong ways that we can encourage research in these HEIs. We can have one more question and then we close. We have 5 minutes to closure. Or a comment from anyone.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. And as we wait for a comment from any participants, I must say that these institutions are very open to partnerships, and through the different mechanisms that we have been involved in, for example, through the LASER project, we've really undertaken quite a number of research activities in South Sudan and Somalia, and we currently have projects running. We've had 2 projects running with higher education institutions in South Sudan in partnership with USAID. We currently have a project running in Somalia, still under LASER, and in partnership with USAID. On the RAN previous award, we had quite a number of activities implemented both in South Sudan and Somalia. So there is a goodwill within the institutions within South Sudan and Somalia to partner with other universities, both from the US, from Europe, and also from Africa. So this goodwill could really be helpful in terms of strengthening the capacity of these institutions through partnerships, but also through working together on a number of research projects.
Okay, thank you very much. And our time is up. I see. Okay. So our time is up, but we can keep in touch on email in case anyone has any other question they would like to forward to us. We are open to answer any other question, and we shall close. Nathan, would you like to say a word? And then, okay, maybe I can have my word and then Nathan will close the session. So thank you very much for attending this breakout session, and I would like to pass my sincere gratitude to the long-term assistance and services for research, that is LASER, and then Partner University-Led Solutions Engine Initiative, that we usually call it LASER Pulse Initiative. So because it supported this work and we have done this together. And otherwise, have a good morning, afternoon, evening from wherever you are joining in from. Nathan, can you close the session?
Yes, thank you so much, Angela, and thanks everyone, and thanks to the team that organized this summit. I think it's quite interesting for the HEIs to share what they have been working on. And the beauty is that it's a bigger network, and we hope we can continue the discussions through the app that we are using to connect for this summit, but also we shared our contacts for those that might want to follow up on a number of these areas. The findings from this will also be shared on the LASER website. So for those who might want to read the details about these studies, please feel free to visit the LASER website or the Resilient Africa Network website, which have been shared. So thank you so much, and we look forward to the future interactions.